I want to thank the Tea Party Patriots Alliance for giving me the opportunity to address such a respectable group of loyal Americans. I'm truly honored to be here this evening. But truth be told, I'm here somewhat reluctantly, and I expect that many of you feel the same way. I expect that most of us would rather be at home, relaxing, looking forward to a success-filled day tomorrow, living the American dream. But unfortunately, we all feel it necessary to drop what we would do normally and instead come together here, almost out of self-defense, as a group of very concerned, thoughtful, honest patriots to rally together for a common purpose, the restoration of the American Republic. The Republic of our founding fathers and patriotic ancestors, and the nation of those who have over the years given their lives to defend the gift of freedom, is in dire trouble. There's something very wrong, growing very rapidly in our country, and I do not have to read the list of symptoms to you for you to understand that. And tonight we're going to talk about the one very fundamental enabler of the growth of the present disease that has America in its grip, and that is the private Federal Reserve System of banking, the predominant Western Hemisphere arm of the world banking system. I've divided the talk into 3 parts. Part 1 will provide a historical background as we define the problem we as a nation must resolve. Part 2 will offer a direct look at the Federal Reserve, how it works, and how it is stealing America's wealth and future, and along with it, your wealth and your future. And then Part 3 will describe the solution to the entire perceived problem of the national debt and how to restore the American Republic. And so to help define the problem, let's look at a little history. Over the past 2 centuries, Americans have been warned of the nature of a private central bank and how such an institution would ultimately impoverish the American people and destroy America. It is doing that right now. Among that group was Thomas Jefferson, who wrote, "The central bank is an institution of the most deadly hostility against the principles and form of our Constitution. If the American people allow private banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of their property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered." He said, "Banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies." He said, "Bank paper must be suppressed, and the circulating medium must be restored to the nation to whom it belongs." James Madison said, "History records that the money changers have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit, and violent means possible to maintain their control over governments by controlling money and its issuance." John Adams said, "Banks have done more injury to the religion, morality, tranquility, prosperity, and even wealth of the nation than they ever have or ever will do good." Andrew Jackson said, "I have had men watching you for a long time, and I'm convinced that you have used the funds of the bank to speculate in the breadstuffs of our country. When you won, you divided the profits amongst you, and when you lost, you charged it to the central bank. You are a den of vipers and thieves." Andrew Jackson's 1832 campaign slogan was "Jackson and no bank." John Maynard Keynes wrote, "The best way to destroy the capitalist system was to debauch the currency. By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens." Senator Barry Goldwater, "Does it not seem strange to you that these men just happen to be CFR, that's the Council of Foreign Relations, and just happen to be on the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve that absolutely controls the money and interest rates of this great country? A privately owned organization which has absolutely nothing to do with the United States of America." During his 8 years in office, President Dwight Eisenhower grew to understand the nature of this same group of manipulative banksters and their intimate relationship with certain corporate raiders intent on profiteering at the expense of the wealth of the American people. And so, as he was leaving office, Eisenhower took the opportunity to warn the American people against allowing this cadre of corporate-influenced financiers to grow in influence over the decision-making processes of the American government. Here is what he told us.
Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
President John F. Kennedy understood the nature of the organization I'm bringing to your attention tonight. In the spring of 1961, Kennedy spoke about it and actually asked the press of the United States to help him expose these people for whom they really are. Here is what President Kennedy said.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no secret is revealed. That is why the Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed it a crime for any citizen to shrink from controversy. I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people, confident that with your help, man will be what he was born to be, free and independent.
Over the years, there's been confusion concerning whom Kennedy referred to as this ruthless worldwide conspiracy. At the time, many were taken to believe that he referred to Soviet communism. Obviously, that was not the case, for the Soviets acted in no covert manner. Their leader, Nikita Khrushchev, seen daily on American TV pounding his shoe on a podium and declaring, "We will bury you." As we will discover, the Federal Reserve is simply the largest individual branch bank of the world banking system. Its influence extends to every continent and most nations, and it is this world banking system, of which the Federal Reserve is a primary linchpin, to whom Kennedy referred. Kennedy actually took steps to remove the influence of the Federal Reserve from the American economy. On June 4, 1963, Kennedy signed Executive Order 11110, the effect of which was to strip the Federal Reserve Bank of its power to loan money to the United States federal government at interest. The Federal Treasury would, in place of borrowing from the Fed, issue its own currency at zero interest cost to the government. 4 months later, Kennedy was shot in the head from several different angles, the kill shot coming from the front and from the right. We know that because his head reacted toward the back and to the left. No matter what anyone in the media may tell you, they cannot change the laws of physics or the ability of the American people to think intelligently. So before we go on, let's focus for a moment on the various terms used by these respected American patriots and experts to describe the private central banks of the world. They are an institute of the most deadly hostility existing against the principles and form of our Constitution, more dangerous than standing armies, have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit, and violent means possible, done more injury to the religion, morality, tranquility, prosperity, and even wealth of the nation than they have ever done or ever will do good. A den of vipers and thieves. They confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of the citizens, a privately owned organization which has absolutely nothing to do with the United States of America. Conscription, vast resources, monolithic, ruthless, conspiracy, covert, infiltration, subversion, intimidation, military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, political. So you can see none of these individuals had anything good at all to say about the private central banks, and all of them held them in disdain. Now, a study of the Fed and its inner workings could take off in any number of directions. The study of the influence of the Federal Reserve and world central bankers over American life and the world is just one rabbit hole after another, and each rabbit hole deserves its own time to discuss. But tonight, in the interest of time, I've chosen the one dimension of the big picture that is what I consider the most important tool being used by those whose efforts are destroying America. Without this fundamental tool at their disposal, none of their plans can succeed. None of their rabbit hole agendas and dealings that we might talk about another time can succeed. And that is the manner by which their efforts are funded. Without funding, these people cannot harm us. We all know how vital funding is to advance any agenda. The socialist needs funding, the communist needs funding, and I've heard our president call both. But really, socialism is relatively harmless. It's just a political ideology. It's harmless because it has no inherent mechanism to fund it. Left on its own, a nation voluntarily guided by strict socialism would just go bankrupt, and they would have to try something else. We all know that. Communism, on the other hand, is not really an ideology. Communism is more of a system of control that socialists use to enforce their socialist ideology on the people. They have to do that because no one would voluntarily adapt to socialism as a mere suggestion. They have to be coerced. But even communism, as a system of control, can't stand on its own 2 feet either. Who's going to pay for the prisons? Who's going to pay for the police state? Who's going to pay for the domestic militarism necessary to control the people who do not necessarily want to be controlled, and the people who rebel against the poverty that the communist socialist model of government leaves as an inherent byproduct? No, socialism is not the major enemy here. Communism is not the major enemy here. No, without a mechanism of funding, the socialist communist model of government will soon collapse under its own weight. Without funding, freedom-loving people have nothing to fear from the socialist or the communist. And the funding mechanism is what we're going to talk about. That funding mechanism is called corporate fascism. And the influence, either sought or unsought, of corporate fascism is exactly what President Eisenhower warned us against when he referred to the military-industrial complex. Jefferson spoke of the same group of players. I repeat what he said. If the American people allow private banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation. The banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of their property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. Corporate fascism is a system by which the people's government, over time, becomes so heavily influenced by corporate special interests who have the means necessary to purchase influence at the very highest levels of the people's government, that the government is for all practical purposes eventually taken over by those corporate special interests. At that point, the government becomes almost solely a tool of the corporate special interests. And that is what Eisenhower warned us against, calling this corporate influence, viewed as its own body, the military-industrial complex. That is what all of our founders warned us against. That is what Kennedy tried to stop. As we speak, the corporate fascist state is firmly entrenched at the very heart of the American government, controlling the federal government's policies, controlling the executive branch, controlling the legislative branch, and through those branches actually controlling the Supreme Court. Who do we think actually wrote Obamacare? The insurance companies wrote Obamacare. It is the insurance companies who are going to profit from Obamacare. We know that because while Obamacare was being debated, the insurance companies, the parties who had the most on the line, were silent. Why do we now have only 4 major oil companies rather than 8? Allowing the 8 to combine is one major reason for high oil prices and consistent record of profits for the 4 who remain. Allowing the 8 to combine was an obvious dilution of the effect of the antitrust laws, if not direct violations. Answer: we live in a corporate fascist state where these kinds of violations are acceptable. How can a former governor and senator of New Jersey take control of a major hedge fund in the case of MF Global, use $2 billion of customers' funds without permission, lose it all on a bet in the direction of the euro, leaving the company bankrupt and the customers without recourse, yet the SEC, the FBI, and the Justice Department determined that they cannot identify any laws that were broken? Answer: we live in a corporate fascist state where these kinds of violations are just the cost of doing business. So the private Federal Reserve is the monetary vehicle by which various corporate interests, call them what you will, have come to own direct influence over the workings of the American government. And this is called corporate fascism. Now, a benevolent fascists could do some very good things, but fascists are never benevolent. No, fascists are fascists because they desire to control the masses, while at the same time increasing their wealth at the expense of the masses. Because corporate fascism actually depends upon the people that they suppress and increasingly control, the parasitic nature of this form of government requires that it is ultimately doomed to fail. When people are straitjacketed or impoverished to such a degree that they can no longer support the legitimate business practices of a private economy, the whole system implodes like a house of cards. If this parasitic form of government is not allowed to grow, ultimately it dies of its own weight. And it is so inefficient that if it grows, it must grow geometrically, ingesting everything in its path. The bigger it gets, the more it must eat, and the faster the society dies. And this is where we are in America today. Where else have we seen this? Just a few examples. Ancient biblical societies, Babylon, Egypt, the Roman Empire, the European colonial empires, the Axis powers that brought us World War II, the Soviet Union, and what I describe as a system that is alive at the very heart of the American government today. Presently, it is in its major growth phase. Right now, I sincerely believe we live in a modern-day 1938 Germany. Don't underestimate what I'm telling you. History is our teacher. The next 4 years will tell the story whether America lives or America dies. So how do fascists come to power? Fascists generally come to power portraying themselves as individuals who sincerely desire, in their heart of hearts, to help the great masses of the people. Fascists can become very popular at the outset. Hitler was the most popular man one can imagine. It is said that Mussolini made the trains run on time. So these were very popular people, very well-spoken people. Whom do we know in America today who preaches a socialist philosophy and who came out of nowhere extolling his concern for the great masses of downtrodden people and who rode to power on a sweep of popular sentiment? We should not fool ourselves. For an individual to come seemingly out of nowhere and ascend to the very pinnacle of national power in the most powerful nation on earth, in the short time it took our present president, that person must have had some support of interests powerful enough to buy the influence necessary to achieve that position. Hitler came to power in 1933. How did he do it? The German people were ready for a change. The reparations that they were forced to pay after World War I resulted in hyperinflation of the German mark. Life in Germany had been dismal. People could all remember being forced to take wheelbarrows of cash to the store just to stand in line for a loaf of bread. And life in 1933 wasn't much better. Hitler represented change. Does that sound familiar? But Hitler did not have the support of the German parliament. He needed to create an incident that would shift popular opinion against his political enemies and toward himself in order to gain the political backing necessary to go to the next level of power. So, led by Hermann Goering, Hitler's accomplices burned down the German parliament, the Reichstag, and then Hitler blamed his political opponents, using his uncommon oratory skills. Again, does that sound familiar? Hitler convinced the German people that his enemies were rotten and that they did not have their best interests at heart, and that he, Hitler, was the one who could lead them back to prosperity. And so they voted Hitler in as Chancellor of Germany, and Hitler's enemies were either jailed or killed. Hitler engaged in what is commonly referred as a false flag operation. False flag operations are used all the time, right here in America. A false flag operation, for example, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, was used to gain political support necessary to ramp up the American military presence in Vietnam, which resulted in 58,000 American deaths, millions of Vietnamese deaths, billions of lost American wealth, while enriching the very people Eisenhower warned us against and who Kennedy asked the media to help him expose. Yet the Gulf of Tonkin incident never happened. Years later, Defense Secretary under LBJ would admit that openly.
No, it was just confusion. And events afterwards showed that our judgment that we'd been attacked that day was wrong. It didn't happen.
It didn't happen. What else didn't happen? Or didn't happen according to our government's official narrative? Another rabbit hole to explore. President Kennedy understood that cooperation by the corporate media is a vital ingredient to any successful fascist state. Many of the journalists in the audience who heard Kennedy that day in 1961 were likely, wittingly or unwittingly, a part of the fascist propaganda machine. Beware your favorite mainstream news outlet. And remember, it's not necessarily what they say that counts. It's what they don't say. So Hitler rises to the top, Chancellor of Germany. So what? We all know that one man who might have great oratory skills can't improve conditions merely by speaking. But over the next 4 years, Hitler would supervise a rise of a militarily industrialized nation, the likes of which had never been seen on earth, but one that he had no way, himself or within Germany, to either fund or finance. With the people already starving and unemployed, how was Adolf Hitler, one man, going to fund this incredible military buildup without any other means than he had available domestically, and which, if he tried by diverting the meager resources that he had, would only cause an increase in the economic strife they were experiencing? Answer: Hitler had help. And the people and the organizations who helped Hitler fund the military buildup that almost destroyed the world are still around today. Who helped him? Specifically, Hitler partnered with well-connected German industrialists who were hungering for a way to manufacture and sell their products, and Western banking interests located in Great Britain and the United States, who partnered with the Warburg Bank in Germany. That's how he did it. The American and British banking systems together, supported by the deposits of the American and British people, put Hitler into business. Hitler was a made man. With all the credit he needed to ultimately destroy Europe and beyond, Hitler built Germany into one of the most formidable militaristic police states in history. And the American people and the British people, unbeknownst to them, paid not only for Hitler's militarism that destroyed Europe, but then, through the Marshall Plan, the American people paid to rebuild Europe. And so while all the bankers and the military industrialists enjoy remarkable profits, the world practically destroys itself. And then the bankers continued to enjoy massive profits as the surviving governments had to borrow from them and pay them interest on the reconstruction loans to rebuild the planet. Note that presently, over the past decade that we know of, the United States has either fought wars, is fighting wars, or paying to fight wars or military ventures in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Libya, Syria, Somalia, Mali, Algeria, Tunisia, and now in other nations all across Central Africa. One of my customers' son-in-law was killed in action last April in Mali. So what are we doing in Mali? Well, I'll tell you. It has something to do with gold. Question: where do all these banks get the money to loan out to pay for all these wars and to pay the costs to reconstruct? The answer should mystify you. They just print it out of thin air and charge the borrowing nations interest. They just print it out of thin air. Now that was part one, and I had to tell you that just to tell you what I'm about to tell you about the Federal Reserve, and specifically how that institution is stealing your future and the future of your country. You had to understand the background before you could understand where we are and its importance, and before you might understand where we're heading as a nation of people whose future is being stolen before their very eyes. So now I want to direct your attention to the one provision of the Constitution, the authority to create money, which can be found in Article 1, Section 8, which states very simply, the Congress shall have the power to coin money, among other things. In disregard of our founders' strongest warnings against the establishment of a private central bank, in 1913, coincidentally, 100 years ago today, under some very questionable circumstances, the Federal Reserve Act was passed and signed into law, creating a private central bank that is given all authority to create American legal tender. Just imagine the mischief that you and I could get into if we were given the authority to create money at will and were practically immune from scrutiny for what we did with it. Just imagine. So who owns the Federal Reserve? Because at the time they cleverly used the term federal in the name of the new private central bank, we're all asked to assume that the bank is a U.S. federal government entity. But even the Federal Reserve denies this notion. According to the Fed's website, the Federal Reserve System fulfills its public mission as an independent entity within government. It is not owned by anyone and is not a private, profit-making institution. The Fed continues to say, the Federal Reserve can be more accurately described as independent within government rather than independent of government. So let's look at what the Fed is telling us. Because the Fed is independent and because it is not owned by anyone, the Fed is sovereign. The Fed is a sovereign government within the limits that the Federal Reserve Act allows, which are extremely general limits and not rigorous, and which only the Congress of the United States has the authority to effect. So get that. In 1913, the Congress of the United States created a sovereign government, a shadow government, if you will, that operates within the federal government. And the Congress delegated its constitutional authority to coin money to that shadow government. Let's go further. According to the Fed, the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, which were established by the Congress as operating arms of the nation's central banking system, are organized similarly to private corporations. The reserve banks issue shares of stock to member banks. The reserve banks are not operated for profit, and ownership in a certain amount of stock by commercial banks who are operated by profit is by law a condition of membership in the system. And so, according to the Fed, the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, which are operating arms of the Federal Reserve Central Bank, issue shares of stock to commercial for-profit member banks and are therefore owned by those commercial for-profit member banks. So in summary, the Fed tells us that here we have private commercial banks in each region of the United States, which together own the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, which are the arms of the central banking system that at its core is the Federal Reserve Central Bank, which is a shadow government operating inside the federal government, and which owns all authority to print and distribute money according to its own desires. What do they say? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely? In that money is power, and in that the Fed possesses an absolutely unlimited storehouse of money, the American banking system, as it is operated, is nothing but a recipe for absolute corruption. A few years ago, Alan Greenspan confirmed what I'm telling you. Jim Lehrer asked Greenspan about the proper relationship between the Fed chairman and the President of the United States. Here is that exchange.
What should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a President of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. So long as that is in place and there is no evidence that the administration or the Congress or anybody else is requesting that we do things other than what we think is the appropriate thing, then what the relationships are don't frankly matter.
So according to Alan Greenspan, essentially, as long as the Federal Reserve Act is in place, the relationship between the Fed chairman and the President of the United States really doesn't matter. One inescapable conclusion is that, in the end, the commercial banks that are members of the Federal Reserve System own shares in a shadow government, one that operates within the American government. The other inescapable conclusion is that by virtue of its relationship to its shareholders, the Federal Reserve System possesses a fiduciary responsibility not to the American people, but only to its shareholders, the member banks. That being the case, the commercial banks of the Federal Reserve System, through the Fed, possess ownership and direct influence over a shadow government that operates within the people's government of the United States of America. The Federal Reserve System therefore exists for the private purposes of its commercial member banks and not directly for any national purposes of the American people. This system owns a monopoly on printing American legal tender. This system owns the money that it prints. Federal Reserve notes are called notes because they represent debt owed back to the Federal Reserve System. Every dollar of Federal Reserve currency that presently resides in any account that you may have or anyone may have in the entire world is ultimately owed back to the Fed and is in some direct or indirect way paying interest to the Fed through the Fed's member banks. Let's see how that works. Every Federal Reserve dollar is created in the same way. It is issued as a loan in exchange for a promise to pay back. So each dollar in circulation represents a dollar's worth of the overall debt owed the Federal Reserve System. But you say, well, I paid off all my loans and I don't owe anything to anyone. My answer to you is that somewhere, someone owes more money than they have the ability to pay, so much more than their equal share of the money supply debt that they owe both their share and your share as well. So all of the money in the outstanding money supply is owed to the Federal Reserve through its member banks, and each dollar of debt owed to the Federal Reserve System commands an interest rate that must be paid back to the member banks. In this way, the entire American money supply is returning a constant yield back to the Federal Reserve System. And for this reason, the Fed is constantly motivated to increase the money supply. So what's wrong with all that? I mean, if you take out a loan, you have to pay it back, right? Well, think about it. Even the United States government, which is owned by the American people, all except for the shadow government portion owned by the banks, pays its bills with Federal Reserve currency. And because in 1913, the Congress outsourced its authority, given it by the people, to print legal tender, to this private central banking system, even the people's government is forced to borrow at interest to pay its bills. And because it gave away the central banking function to a private organization with private motives, the people of the United States, through the United States Treasury Department, are the ones who are forced to pay the interest on the debt that the government accrues. Just think about that. The government of the United States gave away its right to create interest-free money. And ever since, even the government, supposedly sovereign in its own right, has had to pay interest on the money that it borrows. We need to learn to look at our fiscal concerns in the light of this reality. Does the Federal Reserve pay interest on the money it creates? Heck no. The money the Fed creates is nothing but fancy-looking monopoly money. The Fed doesn't owe anything to anyone. And if it did, it would just print the money and pay it off. And how the Fed works is precisely the way the United States Treasury Department, under the supervision of Congress, is supposed to operate. That is exactly what Jefferson told us. Every function of the Fed could be, and rightfully should be, operated under the auspices of the United States Treasury and use a national sovereign currency rather than a private currency. If that were the case, the United States government would rarely, if ever, have to borrow. As long as the government stays within the scope and size restricted by the Constitution, the cost of running government would be covered by the interest it would receive directly from the private banks who borrow from the Fed to make loans within the American and international economies. So in summary, every dollar of Federal Reserve currency that you possess is actually owned and owed back to the Fed. Possession of Fed currency is possession of debt. The entire money supply pays a yield to the Federal Reserve System. And the more money in the outstanding money supply, the more profit the Federal Reserve System makes. Now here's the hitch, the hidden truth of the entire illicit monetary scheme as it's being operated under the authority of the Federal Reserve shadow government money creation machine. Because the cost of government itself is a drain on the private economy, and because of the drain of paying interest back to the Federal Reserve on every outstanding dollar in the money supply, there is not enough money in circulation to pay off the national debt without impoverishing the private sector. And the more the government borrows to spend, the worse that equation gets. Because the money supply only increases by the issuance of debt in the form of a principal amount owed back to the Federal Reserve. And because the Federal Reserve does not issue money to pay the interest on that principal, consequently, there is not enough money in circulation to pay both interest owed on the money supply and the principal owed back to the Fed. The interest owed to the Fed on the outstanding money supply, therefore, can only be paid by borrowing more debt from the Fed and paying the interest on the old debt out of new principal just borrowed. Let me repeat that. The interest owed to the Fed on the outstanding money supply can only be paid by borrowing more debt from the Fed and paying the interest on the old debt out of the principal just borrowed. The Federal Reserve System is a pyramid scheme of the highest order, designed ultimately to enslave the American people. The Federal Reserve System was designed to indebt the American people and their government to a relatively small cadre of elite financiers who run a shadow government unaccountable to anyone inside of the United States federal government. For this reason, under the Federal Reserve System, it is impossible for the United States to become a nation other than one completely encumbered with debt. The money supply itself is debt. In 1913, the Congress gave away the right to create interest-free money to a corrupt and corrupting shadow government and body of influence, one that maintains its position of influence by both buying and enabling the buying of influence over the decisions of our nation's leaders. In 1913, the United States government sold America out. They made a deal with the devil. So let's audit the Fed. You've heard that before. Both Georgia senators advocate auditing the Fed. And for years, Majority Leader Harry Reid argued for a Fed audit. Of course, now Reid tells us that a Fed audit is not necessary. Now, why would any responsible representative of the American people not want to know what the nation's central bank is doing with the money supply? That's just a rhetorical question. Obviously, whether the Fed should be audited or not is simply a ball these people play with, tossing it back and forth, whomever needing political cover at the time receiving it. In 2009, Ben Bernanke testified before the House Banking Committee, and he indicated that a General Accounting Office audit of the Fed would not be advisable. When asked why that might be, here is what he said.
Do you think it would cause problems for the Fed or for the economy if that legislation was passed?
My concern about the legislation is that if the GAO is auditing not only the operational aspects of our programs and the details of the programs, but is making judgments about our policy decisions, that would effectively be a takeover of monetary policy by the Congress, a repudiation of the independence of the Federal Reserve, which would be highly destructive to the stability of the financial system, the dollar, and our national economic situation.
Oh, really? But despite Mr. Bernanke's objections, did you know that in 2009 they actually did perform an audit of the Fed? Over the time period from 2007 to 2011. Likely you did not know that. You wouldn't have heard it on Fox News. Let's take a look at what they found. $16 trillion had been secretly given out to U.S. banks and corporations and foreign banks and foreign nations everywhere from France to Scotland. Between December 2007 and June 2010, the Federal Reserve secretly made these payments and virtually none of the money had been returned, and it was loaned out at 0% interest. So our government has to pay interest, but foreign banks, domestic banks, and foreign countries don't have to pay interest. So who received over $16 trillion of American taxpayer money? Citigroup, $2.5 trillion. Morgan Stanley, $2.04 trillion. Merrill Lynch, $1.95 trillion. Bank of America, $1.3 trillion. And all the rest of them are merely billions. So I won't go through those. So let's do the math. If the money is not paid back and stays in circulation, based upon 300 million American citizens not already on the government dole, that $16 trillion costs each American man, woman, and child $53,333. It costs a family of four $213,333. Remember what Andrew Jackson said. He said, "Bankers speculate on the breadstuffs of our country. When you won, you divided the profits amongst you, and when you lost, you charged it to the central bank. You are a den of vipers and thieves." Notice the biblical reference here. These are the money changers in the temple we're talking about. They are the only group against whom Jesus Christ was ever recorded committing a violent act. That should tell you something. The banks in the Federal Reserve System operate with virtually no risk, gambling with American wealth, dividing the profits when they win, and enlarging the money supply through the Federal Reserve open market operations when they lose, effectively charging the losses to the American people. Are you beginning to understand how the Fed is stealing your future? All right, let's go through TARP and quantitative easing so that you can understand how the Fed is accelerating the confiscation of American wealth right in front of your eyes, the eyes of Congress, and the President of the United States. So what was TARP? The Troubled Assets Relief Program. It was legal theft by taking of the American Treasury. By requiring the borrowing of a principal amount of almost $800 billion, which was added directly to the national debt, which was then used to pay directly to Fed member banks, the banks who own the Federal Reserve System stole your money outright and did it legally. Our senators and our representatives have either no idea what's going on or they sold us out. One or the other. TARP was a way to directly remove wealth from the American people, give it to the private banks gratis, and place the American people further in debt by doing so. QE2. What was QE2? TARP was QE1. QE2 was legal theft by conversion in a theoretical sense because each new dollar placed into circulation purchases an asset of value that securitizes the loan, which increases the value of the American economy as a whole. The value of a dollar of Fed currency is equal to the value of the American economy divided by the outstanding money supply. Whatever that theoretical number is, that's the value of a dollar at any particular moment. Under QE2, even the normal fractional banking reserve requirement was waived, and in lieu of a reserve requirement, the cash-strapped member banks were able to place an IOU with the Federal Reserve, at which time they could legally lend out 10 times the amount of the IOU in the form of loans. Funny though, none of the banks increased their loan portfolios. Instead, what did they do? They purchased massive amounts of U.S. debt, Treasury bonds, bidding up the cost of Treasury bonds, lowering their yield to historic lows, which is why we have such low interest rates. But even if the yield were merely 1%, the interest paid on those risk-free bonds with no investment made gave the banks an infinite yield on 10 times the face value of a mere IOU. In so doing, the banks increased the money supply by the amount of the money with which they purchased the Treasury bonds, which lowered the value of each dollar in your pocket and in the money supply as a whole, while indebting the American people to the banks all the more. QE3. QE3 is also known as QE infinity. It is legal theft by conversion in several respects. Under QE3, the Fed, as the central bank itself, rather than any of its member banks, is directly inflating the money supply and indebting the American people at the same time by purchasing U.S. Treasury bonds at the clip of $45 billion per month. And they are buying this American debt with money created by mere computer keystrokes. So each month, the wealth of the American people is being devalued by the proportion that $45 billion represents to the entire money supply. And that same amount is due and payable back to the Federal Reserve at interest, which is double jeopardy. Simultaneously, the Fed is purchasing directly again mortgages bundled as securities from various sources to the tune of $40 billion per month. And so when any of these mortgages are not paid, the Federal Reserve will foreclose and take ownership of the property. How long does it take to pay off your mortgage? 15, 20, 30 years? Well, the Fed is buying up mortgages all over America, just like yours, using mere computer keystrokes in the fraction of a second. So under QE3, the money supply, once again, is increased by $45 billion on top of the other $40 billion per month decreasing the value of your money in the prorated share of the money supply that you own. And when the economy implodes because of the collapse of the dollar, and you're laid off and you can't pay your mortgage, Ben Bernanke will take ownership of your property, earning the right to foreclose, having made a few computer keystrokes as commander-in-chief of the American shadow government banking system. So what we're seeing here is that over time, through legalized fraud, direct theft, and theft by conversion, the Federal Reserve is co-opting the wealth of America, stealing the wealth of America, your wealth, and your future. And that wealth is accruing to the banks of the Federal Reserve's shadow government banking system. So what is QE3 costing you? Just figuring this one illicit program called QE3 as it operates today, and assuming 300 million effective Americans not already living on the government handout, the cost to each and every American just by the factor of increasing the money supply is $283 a month. For a household of 4, that makes $1,133 a month. That's $13,600 a year. You say, well, look, my money is losing value, but it's not losing value that fast. Well, that's just because the clock hasn't really started clicking yet. As long as Bernanke is stuffing money into the economy at the same rate or higher, then the interest clock takes it away. The balloon keeps inflating. The surface tension on the balloon keeps the value of your money somewhat stable. But as soon as Bernanke stops stuffing the mattress, as soon as he stops blowing up the balloon, the leak in the balloon will cause it to deflate, and the true value of the money supply will find its new equilibrium. At that point, we're likely to see a major economic event. The dollar will necessarily shrink in value, and likely very quickly. At the same time, the drop in the demand of the U.S. Treasury bond will require that the yield on Treasury bonds will increase. The world will have to decide on what gambling on U.S. Treasury bonds might be worth. Under a rampant inflation scenario, the yield on Treasury bonds would likely have to be greater than the inflation just to induce people to buy them. So what's the end game here? Good question, one the Federal Reserve is not going to answer for you. But there are enough data points for reasonable people to make informed judgments on the answer to that question. Those data points indicate that this is all about destroying American currency, and with it the American economy, and coming to the rescue with a new global currency, sponsored by the parent company of the Federal Reserve, the World Bank. This new currency would ultimately exist as a cashless currency, an electronic currency, one in which a stop could be conceivably placed on any particular dissenter's accounts. To these people, currency is not a medium of exchange. Currency is a medium of control. And so I appeal to the Tea Party as an honorable, viable, and truly patriotic institution of loyal Americans. I urge you to abandon any sense that the way to responsible government at this time is through fiscal responsibility. In the present environment, the idea of fiscal responsibility in our federal government hardly even applies. When the central bank can print an amount equal to the national debt and distribute that money to its cronies all over the world without even charging interest and not collecting it back, then that kind of money has ceased to be an economic tool for the use of the American people and has become merely a tool of convenience for the private banking system, the purpose of which is, obviously, to covertly distribute American wealth across the world. The battle for fiscal responsibility in our federal government, even if it were valid at some time in the past, is over. That battle is lost. The true battle, which will decide the war that we're fighting to restore the American Republic, just like Jefferson told us, is one to restore the American national sovereign currency. I urge the Tea Party to adopt this as its primary message immediately. There is no time to waste. And that brings us to Part 3, the solution. And actually, this is the very easiest part, at least in theory. The United States national debt could be paid off tomorrow, and the American Republic could be restored to its rightful path. We just have to follow Jefferson's advice. and this would be poetic justice. Since all of the Federal Reserve currency was created with keystrokes, as it was borrowed into circulation, and is therefore owed back to the Fed as keystrokes, all that would be necessary to pay off the national debt would be to collect all Federal Reserve currency, returning it to the Fed in whatever form it might exist, simultaneously issuing U.S. Treasury currency in the same face value and the same form, issuing a check made out to each holder of U.S. debt paid in U.S. sovereign currency for the amount owed, nationalizing the 12 regional Fed banks as U.S. national banks, and thereby nationalizing the outstanding loan portfolios of those national banks, and finally using legislation severing the ties that exist between the commercial member banks of the Federal Reserve System and the Fed. At that point, the U.S. Treasury would have an income stream equal to that of the entire Federal Reserve. Whether there would be any need to borrow additional funds would depend upon fiscal considerations that would dictate that matter. All this could be done tomorrow, at which time the United States would no longer necessarily have to borrow money to operate. America would no longer be under the influence of corporate fascist special interests, and very likely a peace dividend the size of the present national debt would be our reward. This is the issue. Whether the United States and its people should continue to be held hostage by a private central bank and all that that means, or whether we should restore the republic of our founders and once again live under the blessings that God-given liberty provides.